This is Robert Kraft, and I'm your host on SNN.Network, and we're at the MicroCap Rodeo 2019 in Austin, Texas. With me right now is John Vandermosten from Zacks Small Cap Research. He's the Biotech Analyst for this division. John, welcome to this Wall Street View.
Yeah, thank you, Bobby. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you. So, for our audience, let's start off first with your background. Where did you start and how did you develop to where you're at right now?
Sure. Well, actually, it's quite interesting, but my investment career started right here in Austin. I used to work for the Teacher Retirement System of Texas, which is just a couple blocks up the street there, and yeah, exactly. And actually covered a lot of different areas in my early days, but that was all in the large cap space. After that, went up to Dallas to work for a firm called Westwood Management Group, and as a value shop, and actually started covering healthcare when I worked there. And after that, was a healthcare consultant for a little while. And then moved on to be Biotech Analyst at Zacks.
So for you, and this is a question that I really love to ask all of our experts that come on and do an interview with me for this Wall Street View, what's your investing thesis when you're looking at the healthcare industry as a whole? Not just, we'll get into biotech a little bit later, but as a whole, when you're looking at the space, what would that be?
Sure, and I think, the investment approach differs by what sector you're covering. Sure. And in biotech, which I think, it's important to differentiate, biotech, you want to look for very large markets where there's not a lot of competition and where your drug can have a large impact. I think, those three things are what you really want to look for in a name, that has a drug in development.
So let's talk about that, because I've done a number of interviews with CEOs, and when I ask about the target population or the really the market size that they're trying to enter, and then also when it comes to competition, you get big numbers, and then they say, we're one of the few kind of working to develop a certain way in which that's totally different than everybody else. Yeah. So how do you approach it once you get into the minutia there?
Yeah, it's really difficult to know, especially when you're in the early stage of development. And one of the ways we adjust for that is by attaching a probability of success. Because there are a lot of great ideas out there. Sure. But I think once you get into the clinic, and that's phase 1 trials and human trials, you kind of have a sense of how likely it is that you might succeed. And that's when that's when I can really start to assess the value of a company. And, you got to listen to management. It's also very highly dependent on the data. Data is very important. And, also the key opinion leaders in that therapeutic space, if they are climbing on board and they really see some future that resonates there, I think those are, key things to look for.
So how could you simplify, because there's some of my audience members that are watching this that are like, I tend to stay away from biotech or healthcare just because, I'm not a scientist. I'm not as, I don't really know what I'm looking at. So for them, how do you simplify being able to judge and value these various businesses, specifically in biotech?
Sure. Well, one of the things we try to do in our research reports is really walk the investor through, and we assume, some level of scientific knowledge, but definitely not, PhD level or even master's level. If you had a good solid undergrad in science, you probably should be able to get this. But we really try to walk them through the investment thesis, how the drug works, the market sizes, the competition out there. And I think, if you use what we write to help you get to that next stage, that's one way to really demystify the process. But it is, it does take a lot of work. Biotech is not retail. Biotech is not, energy where you can, follow oil prices or you can look at, same store sales. It's a little bit more complex and does take some more effort. But, the payoff can be much greater as well, because a lot of times if these drugs work, a company that's maybe trading for, 40 million market cap can be worth, 400 or 800 million market cap, which is, a 10 or 20 times payoff.
Okay, so here comes one of those, if or one or the other type questions that you always hear on a lot of interviews. So for you, when it comes to a biotech company, would you rather take A+ management with C+ science, or the other way around?
I think, the science is I always hear the same thing from management teams. Data is going to drive the direction of the company. So, you have to take the molecule, because I guess you can always change the management team. But, if you invest in a certain molecule or drug, you really can't change the drug. That's what you invested in. So, yeah, it all comes down to the drug and developing it properly. And I do think there are many, many management teams out there who, have had gone through the process. It's not an easy process, but I think it's well understood by a lot of management teams, how to do it properly. So, to answer your question, I take the better molecule.
What do you do when you come across a company where, let's say they have a great molecule, great science, but they're going after the wrong indication because it's either the market isn't that big, or it's just a completely wrong indication. You know what?
Yeah.
Have you seen that out there?
Yeah, well, I mean, that happens a lot of times. I think, you go back to Viagra, that's one example. I think originally it was used for heart, some kind of heart indication. Didn't work there, but it was a huge blockbuster, for another indication, which shall remain nameless. But that's not the only example. That's probably the best known example. But one of the criticisms of drug development is we kind of focus on the new, the innovative, and once a drug fails for a certain indication, people just kind of forget about it because it's not new and interesting anymore. But I think that there is a lot of value that can be achieved through re-examining some of these drugs that have failed in other indications and look to where they might work in future indications. And one of the reasons for that is because half of the battle of getting a drug approved is understanding the safety side of things, right? It's got to be effective and safe. And if you've already done all this work previously for another indication that failed, you do know its safety profile, right? So if you know its safety profile, half of your work is already done, and if you can find an indication where it works, it'll be a lot easier to get it through. And also there's another thing that there's a lot of research that shows that new chemical entities have a lower probability of success versus non-new chemical entities going through the FDA. And basically a new chemical entity is something they haven't seen before. So if you have a drug that's been seen by the FDA before, you probably have people on staff who've gone through the INDs and the NDAs before, and they know kind of what it's about. So if it comes through again, they're going to have a higher degree of understanding of what's going on there, and you've kind of taken care of that safety side of the equation battle by that. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question in a very, very roundabout way, I think there's a lot of opportunity in re-examining drugs for different indications where they previously failed.
John, for full disclosure, do you own any shares in the company that does own and market Viagra?
No.
So my next question then is, what's the number one question that you get from new investors that are looking at biotech?
Okay, well, I mean, they want a big payoff. so they're looking for something. Exactly. They want something that's gonna have near-term catalyst. I would say that's another one. Another one is certainty in terms of where their balance sheet is. I mean, one of the big risks that I've seen in recent years is we have companies that have very good drugs that are progressing as expected through their clinical trials, but their share prices just aren't kind of keeping up with that trajectory. And I think part of that is just the environment that we're in, this part of the economic cycle that we're in with biotech. Sometimes we're very irrationally exuberant about biotech, and sometimes we're irrationally unexuberant about it. So, that's something to always worry about as well. But I think investors, they like certainty. They like near-term results. You can't always get that with some of the best, the best opportunities. But that's what they want to look. That's what they want.
So another question that I have, and look, we can go on all day, but another question I have that I get a lot from my audience when it comes to looking at biotech companies is burn rate. And usually that burn rate is when they look at that SG&A and they're like, oh, great, the small cap or even micro nano cap, they're paying themselves more than however much it is a year. So how do you evaluate when you're looking at a company's burn rate? And what would you say is a fair and balanced, I guess, salary CEO pay for some of these pre-revenue small micro nano cap biotechs?
Sure. Well, a lot of management pay is in non-cash options or non-cash stock issuances. So I think that's a very important way to do it. CEO pay for some of the companies that are below, $500 million, I would say it's anywhere from, $300,000 to $800,000 a year, with a big component of that being non-cash, stock, some sort of stock-based compensation.
And what would you say that is that target percentage ownership that you'd like to see management have in some of these businesses? Yeah,
I like to see, obviously, if they're invested financially and personally as well. So, it depends on the market cap of the company, but if you see a couple $1 million worth of investment from the senior management team, generally the CEO would be fully invested. Sometimes the other members of the management team aren't so fully invested. But if you see broad ownership across the CEO, CFO, Chief Science Officer, Chief Medical Officer, and some of the other individuals, and also on the board, I think that's a pretty good indication that they have a confidence in what they're doing.
Another question I have, and we've been covering microcap, small, micro nano caps now for a long time, and in this space, you rarely see them get drugs approved, but also the ones that maybe are on the fast track, they just get scooped up real quick. So what have been some of the trends that you've been seeing right now? Are there some of these companies, I don't want you to name any names particularly, if you want, just please disclose, but are you seeing more of the trend of them still getting snatched up by large pharma, or are some of them now trying to build more empire-like businesses?
You see both of those. I think most management teams fall into either two camps. One, they are not marketing and commercialization type companies, and they made that clear. Others, they say they're going to leave it open, depending on how things turn out. And a lot of things depend on the type of drug and what the focus for it is. If it's a very small population or a very small number of hospitals that maybe focus on a certain therapeutic area, they can actually build it internally. If you can build up a sales force of 20 people in the United States and do that, it may work, right? But if you have like a drug for primary care where there's thousands of different physicians out there, you really do need to partner with one of the big pharmas to do it. But I think the value that big pharma brings to the table is their commercialization and marketing and that part of it. They're also very good at taking a drug through the last stages of going through the FDA, because they have specialists on staff who are, very familiar with FDA processes. It's a very difficult thing to put together a new drug application. It's very long. In my conversations with individuals who have done it, you can't get too much and you can't get too little. You have to find, that happy medium, and you need experience to do that. And, Big Pharma has that experience. So I think there's a lot of value that Big Pharma can bring, maybe not so much in innovation. That's what the microcaps can do. But, Big Pharma can come in and take something that shows promise and take it across the finish line.
So now I also have to ask, trends in biotech. What are we seeing right now? What's interesting to you that you've been looking at?
Yeah, one of the things I've been paying attention to this year is gene therapy. I think it's got fascinating potential. We saw a couple of drugs, and I don't own any of these. They're all large cap. But I think Luxturna was in December of 2017. That was for a type of blindness. And then we saw Zolgensma for spinal muscular atrophy. I think that's a Novartis drug. We don't own that. I don't know that. And that was approved, I think, in 2018. And then we saw something approved just in June in Europe in the same space for beta thalassemia, I think. And that was from Bluebird Bio. Okay, don't own that either. So we've seen approvals there, which is a really big hurdle to overcome. That's big. Once the FDA has seen it and kind of understands what the constraints are, what the problems are, it becomes a lot easier for the next one to come through and get approved, just because they understand it. But the problem has been that these drugs are very, very expensive. And I think initially there was hope that somehow that managed care would be able to pay for them, but we've seen that with Luxturna, that first one I mentioned, it's $850,000 per eye. That's very expensive. Zolgensma, that's $2.125 million for that spinal muscular atrophy drug. Very, very expensive. The other one that I spoke about, the one that from Bluebird Bio, that's $1.8 million for that. And there's just, even though these drugs may be saving chronic therapy that would have to be done for the rest of the patient's lives, it's still very difficult to get over that multi-million-dollar hurdle for one person, right? And I think that has slowed down some of the M&A and interest in the space. There was an article that I read just looking at the top 20 gene therapy companies, and they've come off pretty substantially over the last year. And I think that's part of it, just the price.
One more question I have to ask as well is, where the 2020 engine is starting to pick up in politics and next election. A lot of talk about Medicare for all and the raising prices for drugs. And you mentioned just now that some of these are astronomical pricing for some of these drugs. What do you see as potential ways in which to either solve it or reduce some of these pricing? Yeah. Well, you are running, right? Look, it's a big field. We can always add more.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be the next one. But it's a very difficult question to answer. Because what incentivizes a lot of this innovation is the payoff at the end, right? And if you take that away, then you potentially could take away some of the desire to come up with new drugs. It's a very difficult problem. I haven't really seen any efforts by the government so far to really do much. I mean, there's been a lot of talk, but you really haven't seen anything happening. And even if a candidate is elected who is made that their number one priority, I just don't see how they can solve the issue really and actually get it passed into legislation. So, the way I think it's going to get solved is that the market is just going to say this is too expensive, and I think you're seeing that in gene therapy. They're going to have Gene therapy companies are going to have to come up with a way to be better and cheaper. Because I mean, at some point, you just can't, you can't pay for it. I always like to cite the statistic, and it may be more than 18% now, but 18% of GDP, I think in 2017 or 2018, was allocated towards healthcare. That's pretty much one out of every $5. So, that's a pretty large amount, and something's got to change.
So, about to round out the interview here, I want to ask, what's the key takeaway that you'd like our audience to know who follows the biotech space?
Key takeaway, that's a good question. I'm just fascinated by biotech and what it could potentially do out there. I mean, gene therapy is one area that I think is really interesting because I think that because it's well understood how it works and it can actually solve many, many diseases by using the same approach that actually could solve some of these issues, the cost problem. Even though the therapies right now are very expensive. I mean, if you remember back to the first computer, it cost tens of thousands of dollars, and now you can get more on your phone than you ever could at any computer for just a couple $100s. So that would be kind of the area that I think is most exciting right now.
So where can our audience go and find more information about you and Zacks Small Cap Research?
Come look at scr.zacks.com and you'll find a link to all of our research, and you'll get access to our latest article or report for just a click. And if you want more, you can sign up. So.
And can they follow you on social media anyway?
They sure can, yeah. VanJohn10 at VanJohn10 at Twitter. And actually that's a great place to come find commentary and links to our other research when it comes out, and you can see what we're doing.
My name is Robert Kraft, and I'm your host on SNN.Network, and we're at the MicroCap Rodeo 2019 in Austin, Texas. With me again has been John Vandermosten from Zacks Small Cap Research. He's the biotech analyst there. Thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome.